All right. We are back with another weekly segment of the Economic Justice Law Review, weekly scholarship review or weekly scholarship presentation. It's May 9th, 2020. It's Saturday. We're going to try to keep doing these on Wednesdays, but with the COVID issues going on, we just had a few things to interrupt us, but we're going to keep doing this weekly. I'm your host, Andre Smith, Smitty Bonton. You guys know me, 15 years, Penn State, Florida International University, Weiner. Then I spent last year at Howard University School of Law, where I graduated from, and all that. The Economic Justice Law Review is not a publisher of original scholarship. We are the repository for race, economics, and law scholarship that's published in the journals all around the country. So we can bring them to one place for those that are interested in the subject matter. Come here and we can gather those that have been published all around in these law reviews journals in the close to 200 law schools that are out there. And there's a framework, right? So racially asymmetric market imperfections is the framework we're using to categorize that scholarship. So a lot of the scholarship we talk about may not necessarily say economics or race and economics in and of themselves, but it is my belief in a framework to deal with any racially subordinating topic or racially subordinating dynamic can be described in terms of the way it debilitates a free, otherwise or idyllic, free and meritocratic market. In other words, every case of racial subordination is an indignity in and of itself, and we're going to show how it will perpetuate the racial wealth gap into the future by describing the way it degrades an idyllic free market, how the market's imperfections will be asymmetrical with respect to race. And of course, you can transport that to gender and other discrete groups, protected classes, or what have you, or even intersectionalize it. But the framework we're working here is the extent to which racially subordinating dynamics create, maintain, or exacerbate racially asymmetric market engagement or racially asymmetric profit maximization. That's one. Number two, racially asymmetrically imperfect competition. Racially asymmetric market information is three, and asymmetrically distributed societal transaction costs and externalities on a racial nature. So those are the four pillars of a so-called free market, and to the extent they are imperfect, the neoliberal, or whatever you want to call it, construct that is designed to create more fairness and address what can be derided as free market fundamentalism, right? That the free market cannot produce what it promises if the market structures are imperfect. And we add to that they cannot do what they promise. They cannot distribute goods and services efficiently and fairly and justly if those imperfections are also racially asymmetric, right? So that's the framework. That's the framework we're working with. And every week we're bringing about three articles that have been recently published, most often in law journals, sometimes in other places. And this week we're going to feature three fantastic pieces, Prince and Schwarcz on proxy discrimination. That's Anya Prince and Daniel Schwarcz with a recently published paper of proxy discrimination in the age of artificial intelligence and big data out of the Iowa Law Review. Palma, Strand, and Mirkay, fellow tax professors. For those that don't know, I was a tax professor, one of the critical race tax theorists. Shout out to everybody that participates in that, the Infantes and Browns, and Karen Browns, Beverly Moran, all that. We'll talk about Dorothy and everybody that was down with the critical race tax crew in a second, as Palma, Strand, and Mirkay have published Racialized Tax Inequity, Wealth, Racism, and the U.S. System of Taxation in the Northwestern University Journal of Law and Social Policy. And then third, we have Noah Zatz from UCLA on Slavery by Another Name, or his title, Get to Work or Go to Jail, State Violence and the Racialized Production of Precarious Work. That's published in the Journal of Law and Social Inquiry. So this is a paper that melds the language of sociology and law together. So it's a legal topic, but basically in the law, in the language of sociology. Fantastic work. And just to remind you, in previous weeks, last week we talked about Berry and Weiner on ex-offender housing discrimination. Crozier and Garrett on the effects of driver license suspensions, and a fantastic paper. And Jason Bent at Stetson has a fantastic paper called "Algorithmic Affirmative Is Algorithmic Affirmative Action Legal?" Right? We're going to expound on that paper. Prince and Schwartz's on proxy discrimination is a wonderful complement to the Jason Bent piece, talking about racism perpetuated through machine learning, through artificial intelligence. Fantastic work, and something that we all need to take better notice of. It reminds me to also promote Ruha Benjamin out of Princeton, her book, Race After Technology, The New Jim Code. All right, so we'll get back to that. Other papers that we talked about in previous weeks, we can't go all the way back. We've only been doing this video series for a couple weeks, but we've actually been reviewing scholarship for some time now. Recently, we talked about Paul Malika's The Unfinished Mission of Title VII, Black Parity in the American Workplace. Peter Nicholas has a wonderful paper on jurisprudence called Reconstruction. So if you want to talk about the judicial norms, social and legal principles that are being used to, within the construct of formalism, that are being used to reverse and repeal favorable civil rights laws without even saying that it's a repeal, by changing directions through the inconsistent or strategic use of precedents, concurrences, dissents, and what have you. So very interesting piece by Peter Nicholas on Reconstruction. Bernadette Atuahene, fantastic paper called Predatory Cities, talking about tax foreclosures. Beth Colgan, Economic Liberty and Criminal Justice. Just a bunch of wonderful, great papers to inform your scholarship that you can get ideas from, or even citation. And as a matter of fact, we're going to talk about the Strand and Mirkay paper and how rich it was in sources with respect to the racial wealth gap. So first, the first paper we're going to talk about, and again, because it's such a great complement to Jason Bent's, is Algorithmic Affirmative Action Legal. We're going to start with Anya Prince and Daniel Schwartz. Anya Prince is out of Iowa. Daniel Schwartz is at University of Minnesota, and their paper Proxy Discrimination in the Age of Artificial Intelligence and Big Data, 105th volume of the Iowa Law Review, page 1257. Here's my synopsis or my categorization of it within our framework. I'd say it's a strong complement to last week's Is Algorithmic Affirmative Action Legal? So-called racial proxy discrimination by machine learning and artificial intelligence was anticipated by Richard Epstein's Statistical Discrimination, in which he demonstrated how racial stereotypes could in some cases be deployed efficiently towards maximizing profit while excluding racial minorities from competition. His work was a counter to Gary Becker's claim in the Economics of Discrimination that the free market will eliminate racism without government intervention. Epstein's work is consistent with Keeanga Taylor and the rest of them. That is the criticism of racial capitalism. They're coming from two different places, but they're both attacking the idea that racism is always inefficient. So while Bent's piece focuses on Title VII hiring decisions, Prince and Schwartz expound on proxy discrimination in both employment and commercial contexts, like employment decisions, like insurance decisions, right? Genetics and other ways to deal with race or identify race without using race, right? They may be imperfect, but yet and still they promote this disparate impact. They exacerbate the racial wealth gap. They make competition and the market imperfections asymmetrical. Um, the new Jim Code, discrimination in employment in commercial settings maintains and exacerbates racially asymmetric market competition. In the criminal justice context, proxy discrimination represents racially asymmetric societal transaction costs and externalities. Because again, these programs with these tendencies and relying on these correlations are used not just with hiring decisions, they're not just used with insurance decisions, they are also used within law enforcement in lots of different ways. So here's from the abstract, here's straight from the words of Prince and Schwarcz. Big data and artificial intelligence are revolutionizing the ways in which firms, governments, and employers classify individuals. Surprisingly, however, one of the most important threats to anti-discrimination regimes posed by the revolution is largely unexplored and misunderstood in the extant literature. This is the risk that modern algorithms will result in proxy discrimination. Proxy discrimination is a particularly pernicious subset of disparate impact. Like all forms of disparate impact, it involves a facially neutral practice that disproportionately harms members of a protected class. But a practice producing a disparate impact only amounts to proxy discrimination when the usefulness to the discriminator of the facially neutral practice derives at least in part from the very fact that it produces that disparate impact. So we're not talking about just happenstance. We're talking about those who are trying to game the system. Historically, this occurred when a firm intentionally sought to discriminate against members of a protected class by relying on a proxy or class membership, such as a zip code. And you know zip codes as far as hiring or redlining decisions when it comes to mortgages and loans. However, proxy discrimination need not be intentional when membership in a protected class is predictive of a discriminator's need not be intentional. Discriminator's facially neutral goal, making discrimination rational. In these cases, firms may unwittingly proxy discriminate, knowing only that a facially neutral practice produces desirable outcomes. This article argues that AI and big data are game changers when it comes to this risk of unintentional but rational proxy discrimination. Again, this is what ties it to Laxwee's paper on Jason Bent, and this is also what ties it to Richard Epstein's paper, Statistical Discrimination. AIs armed with big data are inherently structured to engage in proxy discrimination whenever they are deprived of information about membership in a legally suspect class whose predictive power cannot be measured more directly by non-suspect data. Simply denying AIs access to the most intuitive proxies for such predictive but suspect characteristics does little to thwart this process. Instead, it simply causes AIs to locate less intuitive proxies, right? For these reasons, AI becomes even smarter and big data becomes even bigger. Proxy discrimination will represent an increasingly fundamental challenge to anti-discrimination regimes that seek to limit discrimination based on potentially predictive traits, right? This article offers a menu of potential strategies for combating this risk of proxy discrimination by AI, including prohibiting the use of non-approved types of discrimination, mandating the collection and disclosure of data about impacted individuals' memberships in legally protected class, and requiring firms to employ statistical models that isolate only the predictive power of non-suspect variables. And again, this blends into Jason Bent's article where he argues, is it legal to put actual racial proxies into the algorithms to counteract poor decisions or poor outcomes by AI machines that latch onto race through proxies. An interesting solution this paper does not present. I mean, it's not this paper's fault. No one does. But we also hardly ever go back to Derek Bell's argument, or at least pondering about the Racial Preference Licensing Act. That if these things are almost imperceptible, it's hard to combat them, then should we, on the other hand, accept that they will exist and instead require a license, those who choose to discriminate proxy or otherwise, to pay into a fund that will help close the racial capital gap, or in some other form or fashion. All right, so enough of Derek Bell's racial preference licensing act from faces at the bottom of the well. So to conclude, Schwartz and Prince write, the risk of proxy discrimination by AIs need not be left unchecked. To the contrary, policymakers have at their disposal a range of options for combating these risks. While the most aggressive of these options would indeed substantially undermine the potential benefits of AI and big data, numerous less aggressive options are available that can allow for an appropriate balancing of the costs and benefits of emerging technologies. Rather than simply ignoring the accelerating threat of proxy discrimination by AIs, policymakers should confront this threat head-on in a way that reflects an informed and sober discussion of how to safeguard the advances made by existing anti-discrimination regimes. Okay, so again, if we're going to invoke Derek Bell, we might as well go all the way through and talk about interest convergence, and also this era, public choice era that we are politically, does not bode well for, as they put it, an informed and sober discussion. Right? We have to basically find out whose interests are at play, right, and see how the competition plays out if the public choice theorists have their way, which under a regime under Citizens United seems to be the case. So that's a fantastic paper by Prince and Schwartz, Proxy Discrimination. Our second paper that we're presenting, or I'm sorry, not presenting, but representing or featuring, is Palma, Strand, and Nick Mirkay, Racialized Tax Inequity, Wealth Racism and the U.S. System of Taxation, published in the Northwestern University Journal of Law and Social Policy. Our description out of the Economic Justice Law Review, or recharacterization in terms of market imperfection, says, regressive taxation by itself perpetuates the racial wealth gap, and I've written a lot about that on taxes, death, and trouble, and whatnot, and thereby exacerbates racially asymmetric market competition via human, social, political, and financial capital gaps. Racially disparate tax subsidies and expenditures, like those for home ownership, represent racially asymmetric transaction costs because they're lowering them for white folks instead of black folks, and even when they do for black folks, we get less of a subsidy than white folks, so that's why it's asymmetrical. While Strand and Mirkay's piece does not include recent work such as Bernadette Tuaheni's important revelations on local and state real estate tax foreclosures in predatory cities, or Alicia Player-Hopel's paper on low-income housing tax credit, it does provide a treasure trove of recent sources assessing the extent of the racial wealth gap as it exists today in 2020 and in the recent past, including important works by Sandy Dougherty, Richard Rothstein, Dorothy Brown, and Ira Katz-Nelson. So here's a little from the paper, Racialized Tax Inequity. This article describes the connection between wealth inequality and the increasing structural racism in the U.S. tax system since the 1980s. And I like that I point to 1980s because I'm in Taxes, Death, and Trouble. I point to neoconservatism as a program that begins around the same time. Like I argue that Bob Jones versus U.S. 1983, that was more or less the final straw for the neoconservatives, and it's been an assault on progressive and racial realism or racial civil rights laws and whatnot since. A long-term sociological view, The Why, reveals the historical racialization of wealth and the shift in the tax system overall beginning around 1980 to protect and exacerbate wealth inequality, which had been fueled by racial animus and anxiety. I disagree about animus and anxiety. Again, by pointing to neoconservatism, I argue that it is self-interest, right? It is to have a impoverished caste or class that must take the dirty jobs of society, and we see through this COVID pandemic who is dying because they have jobs that they can't leave, and we talk about imperfect competition. So I don't believe it's animus. I do believe it is still self or group interest. A critical tax view, the how, highlights a shift over the same time period at both federal and state levels from taxes on wealth to taxes on income and then to taxes on consumption for greater to less progressivity. Both of these shifts disproportionately benefit whites while disproportionately burdening blacks and other people of color. Here's some from the introduction. This article emerges from a series of conversations between the authors, but both professors of law. One of us, Palma, has written extensively on racism in the United States and its evolving manifestations over time. The other, Mirkay, is a tax specialist with a tax lawyer's grasp of the intricacies not only of federal tax law, but of state and local tax as well. All right. In part one, Palma sets forth the case for posing the question. She links taxes and inequality to race and inequality. She traces the evolutionary history of racism in the United States and highlights relevant features of wealth in the 21st century. Now, I wrote the book Tax Law and Racial Economic Justice that talked about taxation in this country and the creation of the racial wealth gap all the way back to the U.S. Constitution. Unfortunately, it did not merit citation in this work, nor did Sean Rochester's The Black Tax, or Beverly Moran's work either. She concludes that the tax system is a form of structural racism that is just now being named and explored. In part two, Nick examines federal and state tax systems holistically, searching for evidence to support or challenge Palma's assertion. He finds ample support in the Federal Internal Revenue Code and even more evidence in the survey of state tax systems. The IRC and many state tax codes operate directly to increase wealth inequality, deepening pre-existing historical-based racial wealth disparities. The recent Tax and Jobs Act of 2017 intensifies these effects. Finally, in part three, we assess the political, legal, and social landscape that has led the nation to the current status quo of racialized tax inequity and racialized wealth inequality. In this part, we also highlight the connection between tax inequity and investment in public infrastructure, and we offer some initial insights regarding strategies for moving towards equity. So, again, this is a very interesting paper, and it does bring some new insights, especially when it comes to racial inequity in state taxes and as far as infrastructure. However, I gotta admit, and it presents, again, a lot of great sources about the racial wealth gap as it exists between 2015 and 2020. It presents a lot of it as it relates to home ownership and does, in fact, cite Dorothy Brown. However, it does not, gives a lot of short shrift to John Powell, Beverly Moran, Karen Brown, Bridget Crawford. There's been so many people that have talked about. Myself, I've written 2 books that have written on racism and the U.S. tax code. Even outside of law schools, Robin Einhorn, American Taxation, American Slavery. Calvin Johnson's the meaning of the Founders' Constitution. Delved very much into the link between taxation and racism or white supremacy in America. So a good paper by them and a lot of sources on the current racial wealth gap. And lastly, the third paper is Zatz, Noah Zatz, Get to Work or Go to Jail, State Violence, and the Racialized Production of Precarious Work. And again, let's talk about precarious work. Is so timely when we're talking about disproportional black deaths at the hands of COVID. While media and narratives, of course, because of interest convergence, doesn't want to deal with the real problem, it's laid at the feet of black people and unhealthy lifestyles. When we know that beyond that, underlying all of it, from precarious jobs to being having disproportionately relying on public transportation, to having smaller homes and apartments with more people in them and less able to social distance. All right, they all go back to the racial wealth gap. Right? So let's my description of this paper before we get to Noah Zatz's words, my description of it in an economic words. I'm actually going to go a little longer on this one because I think it's such a poignant piece because it deals with the issue of racism and work. We were not brought here to be genocide. Was not the idea. They didn't bring us here to kill us. They brought us here to work. All right. So My description of it again: I have often quipped that white neoliberals don't give a damn about it. I've often quipped that while neoliberals don't give a damn about us, neoconservatives are trying to kill us. That, of course, is a bit of an overstatement, considering the original reason black folks were brought to America was to work for cheap. While the focus on neoliberalism lends towards restricting blame on a non-intentional system that just happens to perpetuate past subordination, it absolves blame and distracts our attention from forces revealed by this Trump presidency who actively yet surreptitiously, and by that I mean they do it within the Supreme Court's jurisprudence, seek to further game the system against black people and people of color. In other words, the racial wealth gap has a purpose, and COVID-19 exposes it, to create a loose racial caste system where black folks must accept whatever employment is available, regardless of the poor wages, oppressive terms, or wretched conditions, or else have one's labor sold by the state as they criminalize poverty and take advantage of the 13th Amendment's exception to involuntary servitude for the duly convicted, right? More specific to economics, racially disproportionate criminal law enforcement represents asymmetrically distributed societal transaction costs. To the extent contemporary prison work schemes disproportionately apply a 100% tax rate on black labor, they exacerbate racially asymmetric market engagement in the short run via ex-offender structural impediments, and long run to withdrawal generally from a system divorced from the protection of public safety, instead committed to group subordination and exploitation, if not outright slavery by another name. The redistribution of wealth via 100% tax on black labor exacerbates the racial wealth gap and thereby perpetuates racially asymmetric market competition. Perpetuation of the racist stereotype that minorities are lazy reinforces racially asymmetric market information about black people. And from a political science perspective, Professor Zatz poignantly notes how what I call taxes, death, and trouble does not comfortably fit within the dynamics of deregulatory neoliberalism. It is neoconservatism. It is intentionally setting the lower classes against each other, with the majority of white against others, real or imagined, foreign or domestic. That's us, black folks. He does not identify neoconservative as the Zatz does not identify neoconservatism as the source of the problem. Similarly, the author correctly points to the incongruence of prison labor schemes with Gary Becker's taste for disassociation, but he doesn't go further and identify its consistency with Richard McAdams' so-called taste for subordination. So it's a very great paper. It's wonderful in what it presents, but again, my critique of it is that it identifies neoliberalism. It attacks neoliberalism just as much as progressive scholars do today. But then as it notes how this fits uncomfortably within neoliberalism, he doesn't take it further and go to what I view as the real problem, the neoconservative regime that is intentionally gaming the system against black folks. Again, the Stephen Millers in the White House are not neoliberal. Donald Trump is not neoliberal. They are neoconservative, right? They believe in an aristocracy, a very small aristocracy. They believe in a smaller number of philosophers and thinkers to support them, and that the rest of the country, the vast majority, is the vulgar who cannot be helped, that needs to be duped at every turn into a false sense of excessive nationalism and fight any others that can be put in for them, so that they could enter nobility through valorous service against minorities, others, foreign or domestic, real or manufactured. All right, so from the paper itself, get to work or go to jail, state violence, and the racialized production of precarious work. Work requirements backed by threats of incarceration offer a fertile but neglected site for a socio-legal inquiry. These carceral work mandates confound familiar accounts of both the neoliberal state's production of precarious work through deregulation and the penal systems or the penal state's production of racialized exclusion from labor markets. In two illustrative contexts, child support enforcement and criminal legal debt, Demands for work emerge as efforts to increase and then seize earnings from indigent debtors. An ability to pay is defined to include an ability to work. In a third, demands for work are imposed directly through probation, parole, and other community supervision. In each context, the carceral state regulates work outside of prison. It defines appropriate labor conditions through concepts of voluntary unemployment, and it enables employers to discipline or retaliate against workers by triggering state violence. Additionally, mandated work may be removed from employment law protections when the carceral context dominates the socio-legal meaning. Finally, the resulting vulnerable workforce can be used to displace or discipline other workers not personally subject to carceral work mandates. And again, this is how the degradation and the impoverishment of black folks hurts everyone else, because if employers can use slave labor, if they can use black impoverished labor, then that drags down the wages of other folks. So just as a rising tide may lift all boats, a sinking one will drag others down with it. So hands down, go to work. Read the signs raised by white counter-protesters. They sought to rebut hands up, don't shoot, the refrain of black political mobilization after Michael Brown's killing by police in Ferguson, Missouri. Go to work, that slogan, go to work, reflects a recurring racial trope in the United States. The specter of insufficiently motivated black or brown workers both blames social distress on its victims and affirmatively justifies coercion into subordinated labor. Racialized institutional demands to go to work characterize recent welfare reform, but historically they are no stranger to the criminal legal system, right? Slavery by another name. Stretching well beyond prison labor and the convict lease, police action and threats of incarceration have governed work by nominally free labor through such devices as vagrancy laws and debt peonage. Just the three examples illustrate how major state institutions issue and enforce the ultimatum, get to work or go to jail, child support enforcement, collection of criminal fines and fees, and community supervision such as probation and parole. The first two translate claims for payment into demands for work. The third imposes work requirements directly while also reinforcing the first two. Each operates on a large scale and reflects the thorough racialization of both criminal legal institutions and economic inequality. By considering them together and analyzing their structural similarities, this article highlights the breadth and intensity of such work demands and also suggests how they may constitute a more general technique of poverty governance. Moreover, because these practices often are integral to policy reforms, seeking alternatives to incarceration and combating barriers to employment, they may figure increasingly in new assemblages of welfare treatment and punishment. So, Noah Zatz with an interesting paper on, again, this prison industrial complex and its relationship, or its trending towards slavery by a name, the criminalization of poverty, and the use of that poverty towards labor, because the 13th Amendment allows involuntary servitude for the duly convicted. And fortunately, what the best things about Professor Zatz's paper is the recognition that the degradation or the widening of the racial wealth gap for black folks, the impoverishment, the enslavement of those folks will in fact drag down the wages of others, because that labor market competition will create a greater supply for that work. A greater demand for that work without the supply, and therefore the prices will go down. So, again, these are three fantastic papers, Prince and Schwarcz on proxy discrimination, Strand and Mirkay on racist taxation, and then we have Zatz on what we'll call the slavery by another name. Three fantastic papers. We'll have three more for you next week. We'll try for Wednesday the 13th, I believe that is. But again, May 9th, 2020, I'm Andre Smith, Smitty Bonton, and that's it for the Economic Justice Law Review. See you next week.